The morning came in gray and cold, the way mornings do in the low country when the air is still, and the mist sits flat on the water like it has nowhere else to go. There were 12 men and 2 women seated around a folding table in the back room of the Gideon Parish Agricultural Extension Office, which smelled of burnt coffee and old carpet, and the particular kind of bureaucratic patience that has long since curdled into indifference. The fluorescent light above hummed. One of the tubes was going out, flickering every few seconds in a rhythm that made people look up without meaning to. At the head of the table sat a man named Gerald Fitch, regional director for a land development and agricultural services company called Meridian Consolidated Holdings, and he had the look of a man who had already decided how the morning would end. His suit was charcoal, his cufflinks were polished. His folder was thin because he did not need much paper to win. He had won this kind of meeting before. He had won it in 3 other parishes in the past 2 years alone. He set a single page on the table in front of him, smoothed it with his palm, and looked around the room with the mild, unhurried confidence of a man who considers himself generous simply for showing up. At the far end of the table, away from Fitch, away from the extension office staff, away from the 2 lawyers on Meridian's side and the single exhausted public advocate who represented the assembled small landowners of the Eastern Basin, sat a man named Eldon Mabry. He was 61 years old. He wore a flannel shirt that had been washed so many times the plaid had softened to suggestion. His hands rested flat on the table. They were wide hands, marked by years in water and mud and wire and weather, and they were completely still. He had brought a cardboard box with him. It sat beside his chair on the floor. Nobody had asked about it yet. Nobody seemed to think it mattered. Fitch had glanced at it once when Eldon walked in, decided it was the kind of thing old men brought to rooms like this, receipts from 20 years ago, insurance papers, maybe a Bible, and he had looked away. That was his first miscalculation, not his last. The matter before the room, as Fitch explained it in his opening remarks, was a straightforward issue of zoning reclassification and drainage corridor adjustment. Meridian Consolidated had purchased the Harwell Tract, 4,000 acres of mixed agricultural and wetland territory along the eastern edge of the parish, and the company intended to develop the upland portions into a large-scale commercial grain operation, while managing the wetland portions through a series of controlled drainage channels that would redirect surface water flow toward the parish's secondary canal network. This, Fitch said, was entirely consistent with state agricultural development code. This, he said, would bring jobs, tax revenue, and improved drainage infrastructure to a region that, frankly, had been underserving its own potential for decades. He said the word frankly with the particular ease of a man who uses it to mean the opposite. He said potential the way people say it when they mean money. He slid copies of the reclassification proposal down the table, 1 sheet per person, and folded his hands and waited for the formality of agreement to begin. The Extension Office Director, a quiet woman named Patrice Duval who had been managing these meetings for 11 years, asked if there were any questions or objections from the landowners present. The farmers at the table shuffled their pages. A few had already read versions of this proposal and had come prepared to express concern and then accept defeat, because that is often what small landowners do when Meridian Consolidated Holdings sends Gerald Fitch to a meeting. But then Eldon Mabry reached down to his cardboard box. He did not rush. He did not make an announcement. He simply reached down, lifted the box onto the table, opened the top, and placed a manila folder in front of himself. He did not open it, he just set it there. And Patrice Duval, who had seen 11 years of these meetings, looked at that folder and then looked at Eldon Mabry's hands, which were still completely still, and something in her expression shifted. Just barely, just enough. Fitch cleared his throat. He said any objections should be submitted in writing to the Regional Zoning Board within the standard 60-day comment period, and that Meridian was happy to engage in good faith dialogue with any affected party, but that the legal and procedural basis for the reclassification was solid, and that frankly the sooner the parish moved forward, the sooner everyone would benefit. He said everyone. He looked at the assembled farmers when he said it. He did not look at the folder in front of Eldon Mabry. Eldon Mabry said nothing. He just opened the folder, and he laid one page on the table, a single page. Old paper, cream-colored with age, the edges soft from handling, a document printed and signed and stamped in the manner of another era. He placed it in front of Patris Duval without a word and leaned back in his chair. That page would take the rest of the morning to explain. And behind it was a story that had begun not in that fluorescent-lit room, but in a wet field 32 years earlier, in the low season before the big flood, when Eldon Mabry's father Earl set a hand-painted sign in the mud at the edge of his land, and decided that what everyone else called worthless was exactly what he needed. Earl Mabry had bought the bottom parcel in the spring of 1987 for what the county assessor at the time described in his notes as a nominal sum reflective of the land's limited agricultural utility. The assessor's language was formal, but his meaning was plain. The land was swamp, not picturesque swamp, not the kind that might attract a tourist dollar or a wildlife photographer. Just low, flat, perpetually saturated ground at the southern edge of the basin, bordered on two sides by the slow dark water of Cypress Run, and on the third side by the drainage easement that the parish had cut through the territory in 1971 to protect the higher corn and soybean ground to the north. Earl's neighbors to the north had good ground, dark topsoil, well-drained, flat enough for machinery, the kind of land that looked like money to the right eye. They had been farming it in corn for a generation. Their yields were strong in good years. Earl had watched them and said nothing. He had always been a man of few words and careful observation. He had read about crawfish aquaculture in a state agricultural bulletin, studied the water chemistry of the basin over 2 seasons, watched which low spots held water longest without going stagnant, and then gone to the county courthouse and asked very quietly about the parcel at the bottom of the world. It was cheap, it was available. He bought it before the month was out. His neighbors had opinions. They expressed them in the way neighbors do, through remarks made at the feed store, through a particular kind of silence at the extension office meetings, through the suggestion offered as concern that Earl was not perhaps making the wisest use of his resources. The word swamp was used. The word foolish was implied. Earl's wife, a small, strong woman named Nora who kept her own counsel on most things, told Eldon years later that his father had heard every one of those opinions and stored them away the way you store something you intend to return to. Not with bitterness, with accuracy. Earl Mabry was not a bitter man, but he was an exact one. The first harvest was modest. Earl worked the pond system by hand in the beginning, learning the rhythms of the crawfish, when they burrowed, when they surfaced, what temperature changes moved them, and which weather patterns slowed them. He kept a composition notebook, black cover, college-ruled, in which he recorded water temperatures, harvest weights, feed schedules, and observations. Not a diary, a log. Clean numbers, brief notations, the language of a man who trusted measurement over sentiment. By the 4th season, he had expanded to 3 ponds. By the 7th, he had a modest commercial arrangement with 2 distributors in the parish seat and 1 buyer in the city who paid well for live delivery. His neighbor's corn did well in those years. Earl did not begrudge them that. He pulled his crawfish, watched the water, wrote in his notebooks, and kept going. Then came the wet year, 1998. The one that farmers in that parish still talk about in the careful, low-voice people reserve for experiences that shook something loose. The spring rains came hard and stayed. The drainage corridor to the north held as long as it could, but by June the low spots were flooding, and by July the water was standing chest-deep in the corn rows of every high-ground operation within 2 miles of the basin. The losses were significant. Several neighbors filed claims, 2 sold parcels they had worked for 30 years. Earl Mabry's crawfish ponds were already underwater managed systems. The flood was, from a crawfish perspective, not a catastrophe. It was a condition. Earl harvested through the wet season with modifications. He lost some equipment to the high water, and he lost one season's plantings on a small experimental rice plot he had begun testing at the field's edge. But he did not lose the ponds. He did not lose the crawfish. He did not lose a year of income. He stood at the edge of his land in late August with water at his ankles and watched the drainage corridor running full and fast to the south and said to Eldon, who was 29 at the time and had been helping him through the worst of it, that the water goes where the ground tells it to go, and a man who listens to the ground will always know where to stand. Zeldin had written that down, not in Earl's notebook, in his own. Earl passed in 2009. He left the land to Eldon in a will written in the same careful, plain language he had used in his composition notebooks. He left the land, the pond systems, the equipment, the leases, and the notebooks. All 17 of them. And he left one other thing, which Nora had pressed into Eldon's hands at the kitchen table the morning after the burial with the instruction that he read it carefully and keep it somewhere he would not lose it. It was a copy of an agreement. A water use and drainage easement agreement dated 1988, signed by Earl Mabry and by a representative of the Gideon Parish Drainage Authority, which at the time was a quasi-governmental entity responsible for managing the basin's water corridor infrastructure. The agreement was detailed. It ran 4 pages. It specified that in exchange for Earl Mabry's consent to the parish's maintenance of the drainage corridor that crossed the southern boundary of his property, and in exchange for his cooperation with the corridor's expanded management in the flood risk years of 1988 through 1992, the parish authority formally acknowledged Earl Mabry's vested water use rights to a designated area of the basin floor, including the portions fed by subsurface flow from the corridor itself. Perpetuity, the word perpetuity was underlined, not by anyone official, by Earl, with a steady hand and blue ink. Below the underline he had written in his tight, precise notation one sentence: "This is what the ground remembers when the paper forgets." The Gideon Parish Drainage Authority had been absorbed into the Regional Water Management Board in 2003. Its records had been archived, not destroyed, archived, in a storage facility in the parish administrative building that was climate-controlled and completely unvisited by anyone from Meridian Consolidated Holdings when they conducted their due diligence on the Harwell Tract acquisition. The Harwell Tract, which included what had once been the corridor land and the adjacent basin floor, had passed through 4 ownership transactions in the years between the Drainage Authority's dissolution and Meridian's purchase. And with each transaction, the easement documentation had grown thinner in the files. Not because it had been invalidated, because no one had looked. Fitch's legal team had run title searches. They were thorough by standard commercial measure. But they had not pulled the archived Drainage Authority records because those records predated the current regional structure and were indexed under a filing system that required knowing what you were looking for. You had to already know about the 1988 agreement to find it. Only one man in that room knew about it. He was sitting at the far end of the table with still hands and an open folder. The single-page Eldon had placed in front of Patris Duval was a certified copy of the easement agreement's cover page, stamped by the parish records office 2 weeks prior. Eldon had requested the certification quietly, without announcement. He had driven to the administrative building on a Tuesday, asked the clerk at the records counter to assist him in locating Drainage Authority documents from the late 1980s, and waited 40 minutes while the clerk searched. The clerk had found the file. She had not seemed to understand its significance. Eldon had paid the certification fee and driven home and put the document in the manila folder and said nothing to anyone. He was good at saying nothing. He had learned it from his father. Patris Duval read the cover page. She read it twice. Then she looked at Eldon and said, "Do you have the full document?" He reached into the cardboard box and set the remaining 3 pages on the table. She spread them out carefully, the way a person handles something that has just become unexpectedly important. The room was quiet. Fitch watched this with the mild irritation of a man who has encountered minor procedural delays before and knows how to manage them. He said, in a measured tone that carried just enough condescension to reveal his confidence, that any existing easement claims on the corridor land would have been addressed in Meridian's title review, and that his legal team would be happy to clarify the chain of documentation for anyone who needed it. He slid a look toward his 2 lawyers. They were looking at the document. One of them reached over and turned the page slowly. His expression did not change, but he stopped blinking. Eldon said, "The easement is on the basin floor." "The part you're draining," Fitch said, "the corridor and basin reconfigurations are within approved drainage authority parameters." Eldon said, "There is no drainage authority. There is this agreement, and it runs with the land." The room waited. The phrase "runs with the land" has a precise legal meaning. It means the right it describes is attached to the property itself, not to the person who originally signed it. It means the right survives transfers of ownership, survives the dissolution of the granting body, and must be honored by any subsequent owner of the affected land. It means that when Meridian Consolidated Holdings purchased the Harwell Tract, they inherited not just the acreage but the obligation. The obligation to Earl Mabry, to the perpetuity he had underlined, to the basin floor where his son now raised crawfish in the same quiet, methodical way Earl had raised them for 30 years. One of Fitch's lawyers leaned forward and read the page again. Then he wrote something on a small notepad and slid it to Fitch without speaking. Fitch read it. He smoothed his page again with his palm. He did not look at Eldon Mabry. He looked at the document. Then he looked at the ceiling briefly, the way people do when they are calculating something that is not going well. He said, his voice still measured but with something new underneath it, that Meridian would of course take this under advisement, and that the proposed drainage reconfiguration would be paused pending a full legal review of the historical easement documentation. He said this carefully. He said it in the formal, retreating language of a man who has been prepared for every kind of resistance, except the kind that comes with a certified stamp and 4 quiet pages. He said Meridian was committed to responsible development. He said committed. The word sat in the room like something no one quite believed. Patrice Duval asked if there were any other materials the landowners wished to submit for the record. Eldon reached into the cardboard box one more time. He set a second folder on the table. This one was thicker. He did not open it immediately. He said, "My father kept records. Water temperature logs, harvest weights, water flow measurements from the corridor for 20 years. I kept them after he passed." He opened the folder. Inside were 17 composition notebooks, black covers, college-ruled, the spines numbered in sequence in Earl's tight blue handwriting. He also set beside them a bound set of printed pages, a hydrological study he had commissioned the prior year from an independent water management consultant, which analyzed the likely effect of the proposed drainage reconfiguration on the subsurface water flows feeding his existing pond systems. The study had cost him $4,000, which he had paid from the Crawfish operations reserves. The study's conclusion, stated plainly on its final page, was that the proposed drainage corridor adjustment would reduce subsurface water delivery to the Mabry Basin pond system by an estimated 63% within 18 months of implementation, effectively eliminating the conditions necessary for commercial crawfish cultivation on the land. It would not destroy the land. It would transform it. It would do what the flood of '98 had not managed to do. It would make Earl Mabry's judgment look wrong in the only language Meridian Consolidated would recognize. The language of losses. One of Fitch's lawyers was now photographing pages with his phone. The other had stepped out of the room. Fitch had stopped smoothing his paper. He sat with his hands in his lap and looked at the composition notebooks the way a man looks at something that has been there longer than he knew, which is to say, with the particular discomfort of realizing he is not the oldest thing in the room. Patris Duval called a 15-minute recess. In the hallway, Fitch's remaining lawyer spoke with him quietly, and Eldon stood near the window with a paper cup of water and looked out at the parking lot and the flat gray sky beyond it. Another farmer, a man named Tomas Guidry, who had been sitting 2 chairs down from Eldon and had mostly watched the morning unfold without speaking, came to stand beside him. Tomas said, "How long have you been sitting on that?" Eldon said since Tuesday. He meant the certification. Tomas understood from his tone that the rest of it had been sitting considerably longer than that. When the meeting resumed, Fitch made an offer. It was structured as a gesture of goodwill. Meridian would provide a one-time payment to Eldon Mabry in exchange for a negotiated release of the easement claim and an agreement to accept a modified drainage corridor route that would, as Fitch framed it, minimize disruption to existing operations. The amount he named was not small. It was the kind of number designed to make a man feel that accepting it would be the reasonable, adult decision. Fitch said it in a tone that suggested only unreasonable people would decline. He said it without ever once acknowledging that the easement was valid, which was itself a form of acknowledgement. You do not offer a number to stop a fight that you are winning. Eldon looked at the offer for a moment. Then he said, "My father signed that agreement because he believed the parish's word was worth something." He was not looking to sell it 30 years later. Fitch said, "Mr. Mabry, we understand the sentimental value. But the practical reality," Eldon said, "I'm not talking about sentiment." The room understood the difference. Not loudly. Quietly, the way things are understood in rooms where people have worked land for generations and know that some things are not for sale because they were never really owned, only tended. Tomas Guidry looked at the table. 2 of the other farmers looked at Eldon. Patris Duval made a note. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Eldon said, "If Meridian proceeds with the reconfiguration as proposed, I'll be submitting the full easement documentation, the hydrological study, and the water flow logs to the State Agricultural Drainage Oversight Board and requesting a formal ruling." "I'd rather not do that, but I have the paper for it." He had the paper for it. The State Oversight Board was not an institution that Meridian Consolidated Holdings was unprepared for, but it was an institution that moved slowly, recorded everything, published its proceedings publicly, and had in recent memory issued 2 significant citations to commercial development operations that had failed to honor pre-existing water use agreements in the basin region. A formal filing would delay Meridian's timeline by an estimated minimum of 14 months. It would flag the acquisition in the state's agricultural land use database. It would, most significantly, attach a procedural encumbrance to the Harwell Tract that would affect Meridian's ability to leverage the land in its current financing arrangement, which was structured around a development timeline that could not absorb a 14-month regulatory pause. This was information Eldon did not announce. He did not need to. Fitch's lawyer had gone back into the room and had written a second note and passed it without drama, and Fitch had read it and looked, for the first time that morning, like a man standing in unfamiliar water without knowing the depth. Patris Duval said she would be formally notating the easement documentation in the meeting record and flagging the proposed drainage reconfiguration as subject to a pending easement review prior to any zoning board submission. She said it plainly, in the careful administrative language of a woman who has learned to protect the record the way other people protect livestock. She asked Fitch if Meridian wished to formally contest the easement's applicability at this stage. He said no. He said it quietly. He gathered his thin folder. His lawyers gathered their materials. Fitch stood, buttoned his jacket, and made a small movement toward the door, then paused. He looked at Eldon Mabry. It was not a look of admiration. It was not a look of respect exactly. It was the look of a man reassessing how he entered a room. He said, "We'll be in touch." Eldon nodded, Fitch left, his lawyers followed. The door to the extension office closed behind them. The farmers around the table did not cheer. They did not raise a fist. A few exhaled. One woman named Berenice Fontenot, who had said nothing all morning and whose family had been in the basin since before the drainage corridor existed, pressed her lips together and nodded once at Eldon. That was enough. Tomas Guidry said something low and simple that made the man beside him almost smile. Patris Duval was already writing in the meeting record, her pen moving steadily across the page, adding to the official account the kind of detail that becomes important later, which is to say, the kind of detail that becomes a record, and records, as Earl Mabry had known, are what the ground remembers when everything else forgets. The formal review took 11 weeks. The State Oversight Board pulled the archived Drainage Authority files independently. They found not only the 1988 agreement, but two adjacent memoranda from 1990 and 1992 that further defined the water use corridor and confirmed the perpetual nature of the basin floor rights. The board's findings were issued in writing. They were unambiguous. The easement was valid. It transferred with the land. Meridian's drainage reconfiguration, as proposed, was not permissible without Eldon Mabry's written consent. Meridian did not appeal the finding. They quietly revised their development plan, rerouting the proposed drainage corridor to the northern edge of the Harwell Tract in a configuration that left the basin floor water flows undisturbed. The revised plan cost them more to engineer and delayed their timeline by 9 months. They did not offer Eldon Mabry anything further. He had not asked them to. In the spring that followed, when the upland corn operations to the north were still recovering from the previous year's drainage disruption caused by Meridian's preparatory earthwork on the track's upper portions, Eldon Mabry's crawfish ponds were producing at their best yield in 6 years. He had added 2 shallow ponds at the basin's eastern edge, expanding into ground his father had surveyed but never developed. Ground Earl had noted in notebook number 11 as promising, subject to water pressure from the corridor holding steady. The corridor had held, the water pressure was steady. Eldon had read that note many times. He read it again the evening after the board's ruling arrived in the mail. He was sitting at the kitchen table with the letter and notebook 11 open beside it. Outside, the light was going gold over the water. The ponds sat flat and still in the last of the afternoon, their surfaces catching the sky, and from a certain angle they did not look like a livelihood or a legal victory or a statement of any kind. They looked like what they were, water held in the right shape, a man who knew what his ground was worth standing in it. He closed the notebook. He put the letter on top of it. He went outside and walked the edge of the nearest pond, checking the aerator lines in the quiet way he had done every evening for 30 years, which was the same way his father had done it, which was the same way the work required. The Crawfish did not know about easements. They did not know about Gerald Fitch or Meridian Consolidated or the 11 weeks of official review or the archived documents in the climate-controlled room at the parish administrative building. They knew the temperature of the water and the pull of the current and the dark, warm bottom. They moved through it the same way they always had, patient, methodical, exactly where they were supposed to be. Eldon watched the water until the light was gone. Then he went inside. Some people spend a lifetime being told what their ground is worth. The ones who know it for themselves are harder to move than anyone expects. The water goes where the ground tells it to go. A man who listens to the ground will always know where to stand. And if this story settled something in you, something about patience and paper and what gets remembered when the powerful stop paying attention, then stay with us. Because somewhere in a county courthouse 2 states east of here, there is a woman named Cecilia Brousard who has been carrying a tin box for 40 years. Inside that box is a receipt, a deed fragment, a handwritten letter, and a number circled in pencil by a man who was told his claim on 42 acres of timberland had expired with the lease. He circled that number because he knew something the timber company that bought the ridge did not. Whether that number still holds and what it would mean if it does is a question worth sitting with. We'll be back with that story soon.